everybody, this is Mr. G, and it's Mr. G Breaks It Down. Today I'm starting a series that I call Evolution, What They Don't Teach You in School. Now, what is the theory of evolution? Well, it's the theory on how the variety of life that we observe today came to be. Now, the theory of evolution is not a theory on the origin of life. That's really important. It assumes that life already existed. Now, according to the theory of evolution, all current and extinct life evolved from one single-cell organism. Now, there are two basic mechanisms involved in evolution. One is random genetic mutations, and the other one is natural selection. Now, genetic mutations are essentially errors in DNA that occur during copying. They're copying errors. And remember, DNA is information, so they're errors in information. Now, the mutations are also random. That means they're not linked to any previous mutations. And the mutations, these errors, produce changes in the organism that must be passed on to the children for evolution to work. Now, that's really important because you hear how people get skin cancer, for example. I can get skin cancer because I've been out in the sun too long. But that's due to a genetic mutation in my skin cell. I'm not going to be able to pass that mutation on to my children. In order for the mutation to be passed on to my children, it has to be mutations that are either in the egg or the sperm cell, which are then what gets passed on to children. Now, the second part is natural selection. You probably know it as survival of the fittest. And basically in natural selection, there are environmental factors that determine whether the mutation is beneficial or not. If it allows the organism to live longer or live better or have more children, it's beneficial. And if the mutation doesn't do that, then the mutation is not beneficial and it doesn't get passed on. Now, how can we relate evolution to something that's kind of easier for us to understand? Well, to try to make more sense of the theory of evolution, let's apply it to something that we're very familiar with. Cars. Cars have changed a lot over the years, or they've evolved over the years. Now, one of the earliest cars is the Ford Model T. It was the first car that was produced using an assembly line. And there was about 84 steps to assemble the Model T, and it took about 70 people to assemble the car. Now, of course, each step already had some pre-built parts like the motor. So, of course, if you consider all the parts that are involved in the assembly, there would be a lot more than 84 steps. So if the Ford Model T was a living organism, and we applied the theory of evolution, then the instruction manual for building and maintaining a Ford Model T would be the DNA. So what would that instruction manual contain? Well, it would include the instructions for building the assembly line, including all the parts and tools needed to build the assembly line, the instructions for building all the parts in the Model T, including all the tools needed to build the parts, the instructions on how to maintain the Model T once it was built, like, for example, changing the oil, including the instructions for building the tools, like building the oil filter wrench, and for obtaining the materials needed to maintain it, like the motor oil. It would include instructions for copying the instruction manual and including it with the new Model T. And the instructions for a quality control system and all the tools needed to make sure the Model T was built correctly and any mistakes were corrected. For example, a steering wheel was put where the wheels go. No, can't do that. Got to put the wheel there. Take off the steering wheel and put the wheel back on. Stuff like that. And a lot more. But this is still not evolution. This is simply, and of course it's not simple, reproduction. It's like having a child. A human being giving birth to a human child. A Model T producing another Model T. That's not evolution. That's reproduction. However, cars have evolved over time. Not just in looks, but in function. Cars used to be steam engines, and now they're gas and diesel engines. They have rubber tires now instead of wooden wheels. They have starters and air conditioning systems and automatic transmissions that they didn't have before. So cars have evolved. Now, according to the theory of evolution, all of these changes would have occurred through random copying errors in the instruction manual for the Model T that were passed on to the new automobile, so that all over time, a Model T became a Ferrari. The errors would typically involve one letter, like a wrong letter or the omission of the letter. Now, although there are significant differences between a Model T and a Ferrari, evolution is not about a car becoming a different car. That's really more like the breeding of dogs. You have a Chihuahua, you have a Great Dane, but in the end, they're still dogs. And you've got a Model T, and you got a Ferrari, but in the end, they're still cars. The theory of evolution would be more like the car becoming, say, a submarine or an airplane. But again, this would still have to happen through a series of random, unlinked copying errors of the original instruction manual for the Model T, one letter at a time, that gets passed on. And this process repeats until eventually a submarine or an airplane is produced. Furthermore, the errors cannot produce changes that result in a sinking car submarine or a crashing car airplane, because then the car submarine or the car airplane would die and it would not pass on the information to the next generation. And most importantly, the changes must occur in the instruction manual first. You can try to drive all the Model Ts you want in the world off of a cliff, but wings are not going to form because it requires changes in the instruction manual. So for example, something like random errors in the instructions on how to make doors would produce the instructions and tools for making wings, except that the changes are random. So these errors would not happen in sequence. You could have an error on making the door, but the next error could be for making a steering wheel. All this occurs one letter at a time. Now, it seems difficult to believe that an airplane can be built from a car instruction manual with lots of copying errors. That's why I said this is what isn't taught in school. And we're talking about cars and airplanes. Living organisms are much more complex. Hopefully you learned something new today and maybe have a little different perspective on the theory of evolution. In my next video, we'll take a deeper dive into the mechanism of genetic mutations. Until next time, this is Mr. G, breaking it down.